Right, Professor Stanley Fish, thank you for being on. Professor Fish is considered to be one of the country's leading public intellectuals and a world-renowned literary theorist and legal scholar. He began his academic career in the English department at the University of California, and then taught at Johns Hopkins, and then at Duke, and then was dean of the College of the Liberal Arts and Sciences at the University of Illinois. Also, Professor Fish is a prolific author, having written over 200 scholarly books and articles, and has written plenty of books, and he's a contributor to the Opinionator for the New York Times. So, Professor Fish, just thinking about, could start off by talking about some of your current work and interest, and see where the conversation leads us. That sounds good.
Well, I've just completed a book called Law at the Movies, where I've taken about, I think, 15 movies, which center on some kind of legal doctrine, and trying to figure out how you make films out of legal arguments. So that's my most recent work.
Wow.
And just before that, I co-published with 3 other authors a casebook on jurisprudence, philosophy of law. So those are the 2 things that I've done recently.
Yeah, sounds good. What would you say is the idea behind the philosophy of law? What's the concept that underlies the kind of contingent laws that we find all across the world, would you say?
Well, that question assumes that there is a universal legal set of legal standards, and that's something very much in debate, because a lot of people believe that legal rules are specific to particular locations, to different countries, so that what is legal in one country might not be in another country, and one country might have legal categories that another country doesn't have at all. In the United States and in the United Kingdom and in much of Europe, the basis of law is the idea of what is called the impartial third. Let's say you and I have a dispute about something, and it gets into the law courts. You have your position and your set of interests. I have my position and my set of interests. The judge is supposed to be an impartial third, that is, doesn't incline toward either of us, but makes a judicious and therefore a judicial opinion, conclusion concerning our claim. So that's one view, that the law is constructed in a way that favors no person or group or interest, but rather stands as a independent standard to which persons of all interests can refer.
Can refer, right? So is that is that practically feasible to construct a system of laws that stands independent of contingent cultural judgments and kind of the moods of the time?
Well, that's a great question, and I would say the answer is, in general, no. It probably can't be done, because every law that's formulated, even the most formal procedural law, does finally have something substantive attached to it. But even if it's impossible to do, many would say the attempt to do it is both worthy and effective. So that the fact that the law doesn't approach that degree of impartiality we like to attribute to it doesn't mean that its attempts to do so don't mean anything. They, in fact, mean a great deal. So again, as with most human institutions, You shouldn't expect perfection from them. That is, that they're going to hit their mark every time. But what you should expect or hope for is that they aspire to hit their mark every time. That's what they're trying to do. And if we have institutions that are aspiring to do the right thing most of the time, we'll be in fairly good shape.
Yeah, yeah. It brings to mind, there's in philosophy, there's a problem sometimes called is versus ought, meaning there's a state of affairs as it really is versus what we suppose that it ought to be.
Right.
What would you say that concerning law, what is it that ought to be, and what are we shooting for? Can we clarify such a standard to ourselves, or is it necessarily subjective and transient?
Well, I don't know. I mean, what it ought to be, and this is another phrase you often hear, the law should be no respecter of persons. That is, the law should treat all who come before it as equals. And of course, then there's the phrase, we are equals before the law. And another way to put this is that at least in the United States, it is claimed that we are a government of laws, not men, by which, again, is meant the idea that our laws do not track the preferences of this one or that one. They in fact stand in a neutral position toward the preferences of everyone. Now, again, this goes back to the question you asked earlier, is this something that is realized in practice? And often the answer is no. Where the law is badly administered or the law is administered by corrupt persons, or legislatures pass bad laws or laws that are impossible to enforce. All of these things happen all the time. But again, and to repeat the point I made earlier, it's a question of striving toward a perfection or toward an achievement that you may never reach. In one of his poems, the English poet Robert Browning said, "A man's reach should exceed his grasp, else what's a heaven for?" That is, you're always there trying for that kind of heavenly status, but never quite reaching it.
Shoot for the moon, and if you miss, you land among the stars, or shoot for the stars, and if you fall short, you land on the moon, right? Something like that.
Yeah, something like that.
That's a great point, right? So I think concerning one part, there is the aspect of making sure that the law is not corrupt and doesn't favor individuals and doesn't favor those in power, those that are financially fortunate. That's certainly one aspect, and we shoot for perfection and obviously come up short to varying extents. There's nations that, right, there's a corruption index, if I'm not mistaken, or ranking with nations that are really high up and a little bit more down. But I think the other aspect here is what would be the purpose of the law in principle. We understand that, again, one part is to not favor anybody, but not favor anybody in regard to what? What are we trying to accomplish? Do we want social stability? Do we want the possibility of progress or the possibility for the arts and sciences to flourish? What is it that or the possibility for human beings to be able to develop? What are we really after?
That's another very fine question, and there have been many answers given to it. One answer is that the law simply protects persons from being injured by their neighbors, and it's a kind of negative, a negative action which doesn't necessarily advance the human race, just keeps some members of the human race from robbing and killing some other members of the human race. This was the view held by political philosopher Thomas Hobbes in his Leviathan, where he put forward as the whole point of the law, securing the safety of individuals and preventing anything like civil war in society. So for him, any legal mechanism that conduced to safety and the avoidance of civil war was good law. Again, with no idea of progress, no idea of moving in some teleological direction. Other people believe that the law, in the course of working itself pure, that's another phrase you sometimes hear, the law in the course of working itself pure is at the same time contributing to the purification of human beings. That is, the society that is ruled by a very good law will itself become in time a better society, because men and women will be guiding their behavior by these excellent laws. Now, there's another tradition, still, there are many of these, but another tradition, often called the natural law tradition, in which the idea is that law is drawing you to an embrace of, and in a sense, a union with the good. This is obviously a theological idea, that laws should be constructed not so much, not just to keep people safe from one another's base instincts, but law should be constructed in a way that helps change base instincts into something better. And now that natural law perspective, which had been in decline for a time, is being revived by a group of legal theorists, especially a professor of law at Harvard, a man by the name of Adrian Vermeule, Vermule, who is about to publish a book, and may now have been published, called Common Good Constitutionalism, where he makes the argument that I just rehearsed a moment ago, that the laws just shouldn't keep the trains running or your property safe. The law should be pulling you, and in some cases, pushing you in a direction of goodness. So there's a whole series of answers to your question.
Well, no, Professor, that's an incredible summary. I think the last point is really worth taking up. So concerning the idea that law can push individuals towards perfection and towards progress, we would also need to then think about what it means to join with the good and to advance ourselves. So one thing that comes to mind is, you mentioned controlling our kind of impulses, right? Controlling our animal side. We can think
Exactly.
about, and we can think a little bit about how that works. And we see that a way, I think, to describe it is that motives act upon us based on who we are and on our stage of development. For example, if a baby, the set of motives relevant to a baby is very limited. You can't go up to a baby and say, please stop crying, I'll give you $100 cash, right? Because the mental development hasn't reached that point. For somebody else, it has, right? And yet still the motives that influence him or her depend on the person's ethical development, the person's human development. So for example, that we could line up 50 people and say, go, goodness forbid, burn down a house, do some crime, here's $1,000. The $1,000 will not force anybody to do it. It will act as a motive for somebody that already has a given state of mind and a given lack of moral development. So one person might come forward, two people, whatever it might be, but it's not going to be everybody, because the money itself is not forcing anybody. So the law then, to connect it with that, the law gives us the possibility of providing counter motives to common impulses and inclinations to commit crimes, to act unjustly, and so forth and so on. But the issue would be that a person has to be fit to cognize the consequence and also hold it out in front of them with an intensity that can overpower the urge to do something. Now, you get what I'm saying? For example,
yes, but that sense of active participation with the law in your own moral reform, as it were, is at the heart of this idea of common good constitutionalism. The problem with it, just one problem with it, is that you have to decide, or someone has to decide, exactly what the good is, and also decide what methods can be employed to pull people toward the good. And inside common good constitutionalism, and quite explicitly acknowledged, I believe, is the idea that the law knows better than you do what you want or what you should want. So common good constitutionalism ends up warring against your own instincts. That is, rather than allowing you as a, let's say, classically liberal theory of law would allow you to freely choose your ends and goals, in common good constitutionalism, your ends and goals are assumed to be correctable, and it's the state and the state's laws that are going to correct them.
So what are those ends and goals that in that framework are to be pursued?
Well, again, that will depend. For Vermeulen, who is a strong Catholic, they're going to be the goals associated, I would say, with good moral behavior as it was viewed maybe 50 to 60 years ago, that you're going to go through life married to the same person, that you're going to work hard, that you are not going to imbibe liquor or ingest drugs, that you're going to spend time with your children, that you're not going to stray, that you're not going to use coarse language, that you're going to be charitable toward others. All the virtues that are associated with what used to be called, again in the 1950s, the good Christian life. That's what I think Vermeulen and those who think as he does have in mind. And that's directly opposed to some, let's take a classic figure in the history of American jurisprudence, the great Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes. And he had a view of the law which is diametrically opposed, I believe, in many ways to common good constitutionalism. He thinks that law was made for the bad person, and that law was there to tell the bad person, if you do X, you will suffer consequence Y. And so again, it's not that the bad person will become less bad if he does X. It's that the bad person will not suffer penalties or be sent to jail if he does X. So that kind of holding operation, which doesn't really disturb or reform the status quo, is one end of a continuum, and at the other end is this common good constitutionalism, where we are all advancing together toward some ideal of moral perfection. And then there's everything in between, those two extremes. But I'm not going to tell you what I believe or what I think, because that's not the kind of work that I do. Both in my teaching and my writing, I think of myself as trying to explain things, analyze things, so that they'll be better understood by those who either listen to me or read me.
Right. Clarify the positions and let people make up their own minds. And that's
well, I don't even know about that.
Well,
I mean, I have a job. I'm a firm believer in disciplinary distinctiveness. That is, each of us in different professions have different jobs to do. And we should be aware of what it is that we're both empowered to do and obligated to do by virtue of our professions. And as a teacher, that is, as someone who teaches both literature in my earlier career and law now, my job is to make important texts and ideas or historical periods accessible to people who might not have before understood them, understood what was going on, how things worked. And then I walk away. And now what you as a student, let's say, who might be in one of my courses, do with what I've been able to deliver to you is your own business. And I can't really design that as a teacher. The only thing that I can design as a teacher is a course that puts you in possession of the material by the end of the course. So much so that you could perhaps on the day after the course was over, turn around and teach it yourself to somebody else. That's all I could do. Actually, that's a hell of a lot to try to do, because teaching isn't easy. But that's the job. And that's to my mind, all of the job, which is why, for example, movements like teaching for social justice, of which you probably have heard, movements like teaching for social justice seem to me to be antithetical to the nature of education, seem to me to be introducing into the business of education, the business of politics. Nothing wrong with the business of politics, but it belongs in the political realm, not in the educational realm. That's more of an answer than you asked for, but
No, those are some phenomenal points, Professor. And having a clear conception of where the boundaries of what one is doing is, I think, essential. For example, if we hire a plumber and the plumber begins to do our electricity without having the training of an electrician, that could be a big problem. So I suppose that if somebody is trained to be a classical scholar or a physicist or a mathematician and they begin to venture into different areas, that can be problematic, and especially when they do, like you mentioned, try to pull the students along with them, right? Because these are young, developing minds, and maybe the best thing is, like you said, to clarify to them what it is that is being taught, make them a master of the material, and then let them kind of formulate their own views, right, without being pushed in that direction.
well, your analogy is apt in part because I come from a family of plumbers.
Oh, really? It's a
Didn't
phenomenal job. It's super important, needless to say.
I didn't go into that family business, but
Oh,
I remember it well.
yeah. All right. So, so going off that, right? I think definitely the veering off in different directions does occur, and I think one of the angles to take here
Well,
is that
it's not only veering off in different directions. That is, you're a professor of literature and you start talking about chemistry, but it's that that's not as bad as if you're a professor of literature or law and you start trying to move your students in the direction of voting for somebody, or in the direction of joining this party, or in the direction of going out and marching for this or that cause. That's when I think something really bad has happened, when you have allowed your virtue instincts to take over and overwhelm your professional obligations. And I really dislike that. But I think right now, a lot of people do that and believe it's the right thing to do.
right, right. I think we can connect kind of these two areas what we were talking about at first, the law and this as well. So we were talking about the conception of law, one that pushes people towards a postulated good or ideal state, and another conception that strictly is for bad people to act as, as counter motives for negative impulses and inclinations. I think, again, what we mentioned before, right? So the kinds of motives that I have, what is appealing to me is based on my degree of humanity. To put it frankly, it's based on my degree of development. For example, you're a literature professor, it's appealing to you to probably read, say, Milton, right? Or to read Shakespeare. But if we go up to somebody that has no interest in literature and we say, hey, do you want to read Milton? They're going to say, no, thank you. probably, right? Or somebody who can't even read, they're going to say, this is not at all appealing to me. So we have to find something different that is appealing to them. For example, food or money or a movie or music, or say somebody's mathematically inclined, solve these math equations, physics, whatever the case might be, right? So each person holds at their own point of development, and what is appealing to them is based on who they are, right? And some of our urges are antisocial. Some of our urges are selfish and animalistically inclined, that are aimed at furthering our own very narrow perceived self-interest. For example, to feel good, to feel powerful, to feel in control, to feel dominant. And prior to a certain point of development, we're going to express these urges in less than ideal ways. For example, everybody wants to feel powerful. Everybody wants to feel superior. Nobody likes feeling inferior, right? Nobody likes feeling downtrodden upon. And without reaching a certain stage of culture and morality and intellect, these urges are going to find subpar at best expression, perhaps very destructive expression. And I think what you were mentioning is going on in the classroom. That's one of those expressions, right? The one way that I can pursue virtue is to work on my humanity, is to work on my love for others, is to work on refining my character traits. And another thing I can do is to, scream or try to destroy things, or to try to, push other people, whatever the case might be. So I think that positive solution would always then be to push for greater human development, to push for greater culture, greater ethical refinement and things of that sort. You get what I'm saying?
Yeah, and also it's the case that institutions, if they're fully developed, and even if they're not formally schools, act as schools. That is, institutions as commonplace as the tax, as our nation's tax schemes, where you are in the habit of thinking of a portion of your income going to the internal revenue, and you didn't choose to do that. In a world where you were able to organize everything from the beginning, you might not, in fact, include that. But we live a life in which the IRA and other institutions, including the law, including the rules of traffic, including innumerable things that have the effect of schooling us away from those animal instincts that you referred to a moment ago. And that's why when things go bad, and now people are at this moment arguing whether or not things have gone this bad, but when things go bad, it's because, or in part because, the institutions which act as our silent schoolmasters have ceased to operate in a healthy manner. No one any longer trusts them, or many people no longer trust them. And therefore, behavior that those institutions would have made, if not impossible, at least difficult, flourishes, because the hold that our institutions have on us has been relaxed. And a lot of people are saying that that's what's happened in the past 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, and it fits nicely what we're saying about countering the impulses and inclinations that we have, facilitating those counter motives, right? Not everybody has an inner intellectual, so say, to push themselves toward virtue and towards the good life. And while we're sort of developing and working ourselves out, it would be great to have institutions that can hold us in place a little bit, just like responsible parents try to do, right? We can't let every kid do whatever they want from the earliest age, or they'll get, goodness forbid, into a spot where there's no coming out of, or very difficult to come out of. So, but what would be then the solution, do you think, Professor, to to veering in a more productive direction?
If I had a good answer to that question, I'd be either in a very high office or extraordinarily wealthy. Uh, but no, I don't know what. I can't now sit back and in my chair and give sound advice to the society. I tend to believe, and many people don't, but I tend to believe in the effects, the real world effects of inspiring leaders, of people who rise and hold themselves out as reservoirs of energy and purpose to which other persons are then attracted. So this is a kind of answer which is anti-institutional in a way, or at least to the side of the institutionalism that I was speaking about a moment ago, because the emergence of such persons is in a way an accident of history, or perhaps, depending on your vocabulary, an accident of grace. Do they emerge? Because at least in the history of human societies, it's more likely that what will emerge are charismatic bad people, people who exert a kind of powerful influence, but not for good causes. So I guess I'm sitting around hoping at this moment that someone's going to emerge who can almost single-handedly turn the ship, if not around, at least in a better direction.
Yeah, that's quite the hope, Professor. And
but that's all it is. It's a hope. It's kind of, it's again vaguely theological, because it's the hope in a way that the Messiah will appear. That the one sent from heaven will come down and help us to order our disorder.
Right. Well, I think that it's certainly not unreasonable to look to individuals for guidance, right? The term institution would seem to refer to an abstraction that in itself is incapable of steering anybody. The concept has to arise in each person's mind individually, and one person's notion of an institution or government is one thing, and another person it's another thing. So yeah, individuals are certainly key, and it would seem that what, like you mentioned, there's a lot of charismatic, albeit not well-intentioned leaders, and I think that would come from holding out one's own perceived private self-interest at the expense of what would be the true good, and the true good would seem to have it that we are all part and parcel of a single reality, right? Our good is interrelated. I cannot reasonably expect to attain to my good while remaining selfish and self-centered and self-fixated, right? I can't say, oh, my true good is to earn money by scamming you and you, right? By manipulating you and you, by being a cult leader, by being a corrupt politician, by being a scammer. That's not my true good. It's just, it's a kind of hypnosis that we enter into, or infantile state, whatever we want to say, right? And our true good, it has to do with that of each other. And I think if the emerging leaders can clarify what their own true good is, right? Not simply, let me be selfish just to be a good guy or girl, but what is our real true self-interest, then that would by necessity, I think, implicate the true good of everybody else, and would counteract what you said.
It's somewhat sad to say so, but previously, in previous generations, one of the things that might join people in a communal effort, an effort in which selfish desires were subsumed in a more general purpose, is war. This was the case with World War II. I lived myself through World War II. I'm that old. It's a case of
No.
this is a case of World War II, where the nation, not every single person, because there are always going to be bad apples operating badly in any context, but the nation in general rose to the situation, rose to the challenge by, producing goods, women taking jobs that they had previously neither had an inclination to do or were not allowed to do, various kinds of charitable and other efforts designed to support our troops, all informed by a generally held conviction that this particular war was a war in which the forces of progress and humanity were opposed to largely destructive forces. And that gave a kind of unity to the everyday activities of American citizens. Now, that kind of thing is probably impossible now, in part because wars are no longer fought necessarily with standing armies that invade, although we now, of course, are faced with a situation where a standing army may invade another country. But the more important thing is the development both of technology and of atomic power, nuclear power, which means, as everybody knows, that the next war, a large war, may be, or would probably be, the last war. So war cannot any longer, even in the abstract, serve that generally ennobling purpose that I spoke of a few moments ago.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, Professor. Back in the day when war was more like maybe a chess game with you had to make close contact with somebody with a bayonet or with a rifle several hundred yards, whatever it might be, then it certainly perhaps could serve, with all the evils in mind, could serve as a catalyst for unity and for national cohesion and progress and all of that. And now not really, right? Because yeah, the weapons have escalated too much. So what are some then social forces? We did mention individual leaders motivating people to be better, but what are some social forces that you perhaps can think of that can serve the role of war, what war used to be?
I don't know. And that brings me back to the moment a little while ago where I said if I had an answer to that question, I would be in a much higher position than I am. I really don't know. There are people who say that what we must do in a moment like this is work on the local level to improve the lives of our fellow citizens and to improve the moral health of our community. So attend to school boards and city or town councils, work with the conservation organizations in your hometown, a whole bunch of other things to do. So don't think big, think local, because if local is in operation long enough, it will in time be transformed into big. So that's one way to think. I'm not sure that I can believe in that. And again, I'm like many Americans today, wondering exactly how, when, and if we are going to return to a more healthy institutional life than we seem to occupy today.
Yeah.
Sorry to be depressing, I suppose, but that's that at the moment is the limit of my thinking.
It's a pragmatic view, realistic view, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
right.
I think what that kind of brings to mind is that if we study history, we can see so many different conceptions that have ruled over the human mind. Right? There's the conception of man as just an animal, or as a political animal, or as an institutional animal, as somebody whose role is to be a pawn in a state scheme, in a military scheme, right? But a conception that I think might be waiting for its turn is to view ourselves as individuals, or as potential individuals, the worth of whom is innate, but also can increase in connection with the development that we attain to, and the good that we ourselves kind of bring out in the course of our development. Meaning, again, we can take an external view of success where I'm purely, my eyes are outward. I'm thinking, okay, my only opportunities to do anything are based on the politics, are based on the economy, right? What job can I do? Maybe there's a gold rush, maybe there's a technology rush, this and that. But another conception would have it that I exist, as an individual, as a self, and I see I can grow, I can develop. I start out as a baby, then as a child, as an adult, and if I really work on myself, work on my mind, and work on my connection with truth, and all of that, I can experience the good. I can experience myself in the way that I want to experience myself, without necessarily the world changing. And yet, excuse me, if all of us thought in that way, and we're focused on elevating our own self, Viola, the world would change, because when numerous individuals that have all been elevated themselves come together, that's a beautiful thing. And that's where we have the flourishing societies, arts, culture, family, and things like that.
Well, I agree with everything you said, but it must be said against the background of the fact that we live in a political organization that is basically liberal, not liberal in the political sense, liberals versus Democrats versus Republicans, but liberal in the classical sense of Enlightenment liberalism, as it's come down to us from Immanuel Kant, Hobbes, John Locke, all the way to, in our century, to philosophers like John Rawls. And that liberalism focuses on the free choices made by autonomous individuals. And a state which has as its center the idea of protecting those free choices is not interested in the choices made, but only in the capacity of each individual to make choices. And what liberal society tends to protect is that capacity, and be relatively indifferent to the content of the choices that are made. And that's what someone like Adrian Vermeule, whom I referenced earlier, is objecting to. The individual-centered state, which results from the triumph of political liberalism. But those ideas that we are all free to choose, that our freedom to choose is the most precious of things, that it should be protected above all else, especially when it takes its strongest form in various versions of libertarianism. That where the idea in libertarian thought, among others, is that the state should be as minimal as possible, that we as individuals should be left to our own devices, to our own freedom, and the state should in no way direct us as to what we should be doing, except perhaps in minimal things like we all drive on the same side of the road, because if we didn't, chaos would occur. So if you inhabit a society in a public world that has been structured by liberal/libertarian thoughts, you're going to spend less time thinking about improving the state of your virtue than you are in thinking about protecting the area of your freedom of choice. So that's what we see, for example, today in the debates about vaccination and whether the state or corporations or businesses should mandate vaccination. And the response on the libertarian side is, of course, that it's up to us to decide what we put in our body and what we don't put in our body. So I would say right now, in terms of what could be called, the rhetoric of popular morality, phrases like, I make my own choices, the state can't tell me what to do, don't tread on me, keep your versions of morality to yourself, etc., etc. I think that whole way of thinking is now, at least on a popular level, in the ascendancy.
Yeah, and I think it's not only a trait of the times. I think, like we mentioned way earlier, the desire to be free, to be unconstrained, is innate, possibly to us, and perhaps the whole life, right? Even we capture a small creature, a chipmunk, a snake, an insect that wants to be free, right? We have an insect that crawls up, you turn it around, it crawls the other way. We want to be free. We don't want to feel that anybody can constrain us. I remember myself when I was little, I was at a summer camp, and I went to the wrong place, and then I was going to leave, and the teacher's like, no, you have to stay here. And 3, 5 years old, maybe, whatever it was, and I was bawling, I was going crazy, like, how can you tell me to stay here, right? This is not necessarily socially conditioned. It's not necessarily characteristic of a given era. This is just our nature from the very earliest days, right? And yet, like we mentioned, the way that we seek for freedom is contingent on our development and on our conception of what is our self-interest. And that conception of our self-interest is tremendously informed by, if not determined by, the conditions of our education, the conditions of our development. So on the one hand, the focus on freedom of choice is essential, but perhaps that's assuming that we presuppose that the actors involved are capable of making choices and want to make choices that are to their own good, right? If we, let's say, somebody says it's all about freedom, so we take a nursery full of infants and we say, you guys and girls do whatever you want, right? There's no more adult supervision. Run wild. That would be criminal, because they haven't yet ascended to the point of life where they can make autonomous, healthy choices. Right, I'm gonna, do work and all of this, whatever the case might be. So we perhaps we should focus on that freedom and having that possibility, which we don't want to take away, and yet put a tremendous amount of thought and focus into that early education, into programs that can perhaps facilitate optimal development, which includes the psychological development, which includes the moral development, the intellectual development, and all of that.
Well, sounds good. I hope it works. I hope it happens.
Yeah, I hope so, Professor. Anything else that you want to talk about?
No, you're asking the questions.
Yeah. Well, if you have some time, maybe we could briefly touch upon your literary interest. We talked a lot about law and politics.
Well, I'll just say that for me, the attraction of studying literature is to see how a small group of men and women can take the language you and I use every day and turn it into something stunning. The words that you find in novels and poems and great plays are the same words, by and large, that are used by us in our daily conversation. But somehow, when in the hands of a supremely gifted artist, something happens. It's not, I think, analyzable in terms of some step-by-step procedure, but something happens, and you get people, and you get verbal artifacts that, when you listen to them or read them, you wonder how anyone could manage to do that with such common resources. In fact, the analogy that I often use is when you're watching professional sports played at a high level, whether it's tennis or basketball or football, you see people who are in some way like you, perform physical feats that you can't even imagine. Hanging in the air, diving off a board and doing 4.5 twists before you hit the water in a clean knife-like gesture. How does one do that? And I have the same question when I come across a line of poetry or a passage of prose which is absolutely extraordinary, and I say to myself, how did he do that, or how did she do that? And then I try to explain something about the process to my students. So that's what attracts me to literary studies, looking for moments like that and then trying to share them with other people.
Yeah, no, that's a great analogy, I think, Professor Wright. We see that, we all have, not everybody, of course, but for the most part, we all have biceps, triceps, hamstrings. We have all the muscles. We have a lot of people have the ability to move a little bit, but you see these capacities taken to their highest excellence and pitch in professional sports, in Super Bowl a couple of days ago, in the Olympic Games, and it's incredible. And it's worth developing that ability to appreciate it, because the stereotype of the kind of Joe Schmo or Jane Doe, I could easily play in the NFL, in the NBA, no effort. It wouldn't take anything, because you're seeing people at an equal level on the screen. So you're like, oh yeah, it doesn't look that hard. So I think it's the same, right, would hold for great literature and great poetry. When you don't really, somebody hasn't developed that capacity to appreciate it. It's like, oh, I write emails too, like, I can also write. But when you develop that capacity, I think reading it's really world-class literature, poetry, it's like, wow, how is it possible to write like that? Who are some of the greatest poets and writers that in your mind that you would place at the top?
Well, I've studied some periods of literature and not others. So my answer to that question would be constrained or limited by my own experience. But in the authors that I've taught, I would say the poet John Milton, another 17th century poet, George Herbert, and a third, Andrew Marvell. These are people who can produce poems of stunning impact, which I study, and then prose writers in the same period. I'll give you an example. At one time, and actually for many decades, perhaps hundreds of years, the second most read book in the Western world was second to the Bible, of course, was John Bunyan's The Pilgrim's Progress. Not a work which many people read today, but I think is a magnificent piece of prose, spiritual autobiography in a way. And it's about a person who wakes up one morning and sees what he had not been aware of before, that he has a big burden on his back and he can't get it off. And in the margins, the author Bunyan identifies that burden as original sin. So that's the plot of the hero's journey. He wants to get rid of the burden so that he will no longer be consumed by and attached to sin. But he doesn't know how to do it. So he goes around asking people, how can I get this burden off my back? What can I do? And nobody can tell him. Finally, he meets someone who has some advice to give. And he points his finger out into the field beyond the small town in which the hero lives. And he says to the hero, do you see that wicker gate out there? And the hero, whose name is Christian, of course, says, no, can't see it. How about that shining light over there? Well, Christian says, I think I see something. And the person he's talking to then says, run toward that light. You know, you can't quite see it. You're not sure, but run in that direction. So he begins to run. Down the main street, there's only one street in his little town. And his neighbors think he's crazy. And his wife and children come out of their house and beg him to stop. And then there's this sentence. But the man put his fingers in his ears and ran on, crying, life, life, eternal life. Now that is a sentence. You know, that is a sentence that, you know, if you can produce something like just one of those in your entire life, you will have done something.
And it requires, I feel like, not only the capacity to be a wordsmith, but also the nature that would, you know, give those words meaning. The person
Absolutely.
has to also be somewhat of a philosopher, somewhat of a theological thinker, right? To form these.
Well, actually, Bunyan was illiterate.
He was illiterate.
He's an illiterate tinker. You know, he's, you know, it's amazing. It's just amazing. But something.
How did he write?
Well, illiterate may be too strong a word, but he was not in any sense a man of learning.
Of learning, right? Yeah.
So, you know, there it is.
It is.
Well, it's been great. It's been great talking to you,
Professor. Yeah, you as well. I think we covered a lot of interesting territory, and I think you offered a great amount of very interesting ideas, and I'm sure people will appreciate. So thank you very much, Professor.
Well, you have a good day.
You too, Professor. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye.